Welcome back to lecture number 31. Today we're talking about an age of reform in American history in the early 19th century. The theme that we're looking at is America and regional culture. And the first learning objective and the only learning objective is explain how and why various reform movements developed and expanded from 1800 to 1848. So let's tackle the causes real quick here with the first key concept. It's the rise of democratic and individualistic beliefs, a response to rationalism, changes to society caused by the market revolution, along with greater social and geographic mobility, contributed to moral and social reforms, and inspired utopian and other religious movements. So the causes here in terms of response to rationalism, we saw this already in the 19th century with transcendentalism. People are no longer thinking that rationalism and logic are the best approach, and now they're really trusting their guts, trusting their intuition as a way to live their lives. And so that's leading to social reforms and trying to better themselves, trying to use that self-reliance that we saw in transcendentalism to make the world a better place. The Second Great Awakening also leads to the reform movement. People are starting to seek salvation in the Second Great Awakening, and one of the ways in which they do that is through doing good deeds, doing good works that will help them cleanse their soul and get them into heaven. Now, we also see utopian movements during this time. A utopia is essentially a perfect place here on Earth. And there were many attempts at utopias in the United States in the early 19th century. A lot of the times they were religiously affiliated. We saw this especially with the Millerites, who believed that the second coming was imminent. And so they were living in very close communities waiting for the second coming of Jesus. And they were also doing this in response to the effects of industrialization or the negative effects that they saw with the market revolution. So they saw that the market revolution made people work a whole lot more. It made them more greedy. It made them want to have more money. And living in a cooperative way in a utopia was a exit from that race to get more money and that greed. So the examples of the utopian movements, the Shakers, as you can see up here in the top right, they got their name because in their religious worship, they would be very lively and they would get up and move around. And so they were at first nicknamed the Shaking Quakers, and then they shortened it to just Shakers. The interesting about the Shakers is that they practiced complete abstinence, that they did not marry. The only way in which they got new members into their community was through recruitment. And because of this, they end up dying out in the early 1900s. The Utopian Society at New Harmony, Indiana, that was meant to try and relieve the pressures of the market revolution. And then the Oneida community in New York. And all of these die out by the mid 1800s just because people would get into conflict with each other. They wouldn't agree on decisions that were made. Or in the case of the Shakers, there were no more members that were adhering to the beliefs of the utopian community. Now, for voluntary organizations, Americans formed new voluntary organizations that aimed to change individual behaviors and improve society through temperance and other reform efforts. So, the amalgamation of all of these different voluntary organizations together are what make up the reform era. One of the most important of these reform movements was temperance, and the American Temperance Society was the most popular of these voluntary organizations. They believed that alcoholism and the drinking of alcohol was the cause for all of the negative things in society, and they were successful in getting legislation passed. They had the support of factory owners because factory owners realized that their workers were going to be a lot more efficient and a lot safer if they didn't come to work drunk. The movement in the 20th century is going to be successful in passing a constitutional amendment to end the sale and consumption of alcohol across the entire country. The political cartoon that you see at the bottom right is some typical propaganda that the American Temperance Society would put out, and it would show all of the steps that would lead to someone from the very first drink to the very bitter end that would come as a result of drinking too much alcohol. So The idea here is that one drink or one sip is going to lead to your demise. It's very reminiscent of the anti-smoking ads that you see today because they work on the same premise that your very first sip or your very first puff is basically as bad as in this situation, death by suicide. Other reform movements that are popular during this time are the public asylum movement. So this includes a whole bunch of different public asylum. Asylum is a place where people can seek help. So the mentally ill movement, or the asylum for the mentally ill, was proposed by Dorothea Dix. So these were people who were mentally ill or had disabilities, and instead of putting them in hospitals or institutions, they would be put in jails, locked up in cages, locked up with chains, and they would be put in situations in which they couldn't clean up after themselves, and it'd just be very unsanitary. And so Dorothea Dix would advocate for the creation of these mentally ill asylums or institutions. There were also poorhouses, schools for the blind and deaf persons, and prisons and penitentiaries. So this is interesting because for the first time, we're starting to reform the way in which we put people into jail. And so the Auburn system was trying to reform this style of punishment, and it's very much like the rest of the period in that it has a religious element to it. The Auburn system is where you think of normally of chain gangs working together, wearing stripes, and this was meant to get them to get the prisoners to value hard work, think about what they've done. In the name penitentiary comes from the word penance, and so they're essentially paying their due or paying their penance for the crimes that they've committed so that they can be reformed people once they leave. More of these reform movements include public education. So the movement for free public education that's tax funded began in the early 1800s. Horace Mann is the person who was the main proponent for it. They would also include moral education that had a strong Protestant influence. And so as a response to this, you also see the rise of many private Catholic schools opening up. You have new religious affiliated universities in the West. Some of them are starting to admit women, like Oberlin College, and the rise of lecture circuits and lyceum society. So people are trying to reform their minds, so trying to become more educated. And Ralph Waldo Emerson, seen here in the bottom left, is one of the lecturers that would go all across New England, sometimes across to other parts of the United States, to lecture and get people to try and improve themselves. On one of his lecture circuits, when he was going through Boston, he actually stayed with the famous poet Emily Dickinson, but she was so shy that she would not come out of her room to greet Emerson. Other reform movements, you have the American Peace Society that opposed the Mexican-American War, the use of phrenology, which is the type of pseudoscience that uses the study of the cranium as a way to think about or to figure out what's going on inside of your head, and other dietary reforms trying to change the way in which we eat. And so this is where we get graham crackers, because they make people's digestive system work a lot more regularly. All right, so abolition. Abolitionists and anti-slavery movements gradually achieved emancipation in the North, contributing to the growth of the free African-American population, even as many state governments restricted African Americans' rights. So we do have a growing free African American population. About 250,000 of the free population lived in the North. The other 250,000 lived in the South. And just because they were free does not mean that they had equal rights. In fact, by virtue of being black, their skin color was automatically associated with slavery. And so the burden of proof would be upon the emancipated person to show that they were free. And so many times they would have to carry pieces of paper like the one seen up here above, which was a proof of manumission paper. They still could not vote. They could not unionize. A lot of the times they would be kept from doing certain types of jobs that would earn them higher wages, and Oftentimes, they would be used as strike breakers. So they would be brought in whenever workers at a factory would strike. Once the strike would be over, they would be fired and let go. They were the source of cheap labor in the North, but once more immigrants started to come into the United States, they were more and more being replaced by immigrants. So they had to find other types of work. In the South, like I said, the burden of proof also fell on them to show that they were free, and those that were free in the South would often remain there to try and maintain relationships or family ties that they had. And there were harsher slave codes in the South because of previously failed enslaved people insurrections. Now, for the abolitionist movement, it begins to grow in the North. At first, in the early 1800s, this begins with the American Colonization Society. And so this is an example of an organization that is trying to do good work, but maybe not doing it in the best way. So they believed that all people who were enslaved should be free, but at the same time, they did not believe that they would viably be able to stay in the United States and live amongst the white population. So they thought that it would be best if they could be put on a ship, go to Africa, and start a colony there. This was also something that the British tried in Sierra Leone, but the United States tried it in Liberia in the early 1800s during the presidency of James Monroe. So the capital of Liberia, the modern day country of Liberia on the west coast of Africa, its capital is Monrovia after James Monroe. After the American Colonization Society, we have the rise of the American Anti-Slavery Society, founded by William Lloyd Garrison. He was also the publisher of the abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator. Garrison was a much more unabashed abolitionist. He was seen as very radical for his time. He advocated for the immediate emancipation of all enslaved people without any sort of recompensation for the enslavers. He took on Frederick Douglass, seen there on the right, as someone who he mentored and sent all across the North to lecture about how Frederick Douglass got his freedom. And Douglass himself, through his power of speech, became one of the most famous people in the entire 19th century, and he was also the most photographed person in the entire 19th century. That means that there are more photographs of Frederick Douglass than of any other person in the 19th century. Because there were some people in the American Anti-Slavery Society that were not as radical as Garrison and wanted to have some compromise to get some sort of progress on abolition, some people left and they created the Liberty Party, which ran political candidates for election. They actually ran two or more than two, but they ran their first presidential campaign in 1840, and they continued through 1852. After that, they merged with other parties of similar ideology. So we have Black abolitionists. The first one is David Walker. He wrote an appeal to the colored citizens of the world, and he is taking a very radical stance again, that the enslaved should demand their freedom by any means necessary. And his pamphlet, his appeal was very much feared in the South as abolitionist literature. It was banned in many southern states. Unfortunately, David Walker died very young, soon after the publishing of his pamphlet. And then, like I said, later on in the late 1830s, early 1840s, Frederick Douglass begins to rise as the main Black abolitionist voice. He's mentored by Garrison, and eventually he begins to publish his own abolitionist newspaper called the North Star. All right, we also have women's rights as a part of this reform era. We have women's rights movements sought to create greater equality and opportunities for men, expressing its ideals at the Seneca Fall Convention. So during this time, women's role had changed because of industrialization. This resulted in smaller families, so women are gaining more time, and because they had more time, they would become involved in some of these reform movements. And it wasn't the women's rights movement that they became involved with right away. They would start with the asylum movement or education or abolition. And then through their experience in all of those different movements, they would move on to women's rights. The cult of domesticity was the main social structure for women. Women were thought to be the moral and religious anchors of the home, and so therefore that was their realm. The women's right movement was really started by Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, so seen in the top right of the screen. They began their advocacy as abolitionists, and when they attended an abolitionist convention in which they were denied speaking privileges because they were women, they left and they said that there needed to be more equality for women in the country and started this women's rights movement. Other female advocates were Margaret Fuller and Sarah Grimke, both writers. Fuller was a journalist. Grimke wrote more on the equality of women. And in 1848, it is culminated with the Seneca Falls Convention, in which they issued the Declaration of Sentiments. This was a document that was modeled after the American Declaration of Independence. And in the parts where it says that all men are created equal, the Seneca Falls Convention changes the wording to say that all men and women are created equal. All of the attendees of the Seneca Falls Convention are seen on that pamphlet. You see all of the ladies and all the gentlemen, and in addition to all of the famous women's rights movement advocates, you also see down in the gentleman section, Frederick Douglass attended the Women's Rights Convention. So he will end up having a good relationship with some of the main leaders of the women's rights movement because they were previously involved in the abolitionist movement. All right, made it to the recap. So the age of reform began due to the market revolution, the Second Great Awakening, expansion of democracy, and transcendentalist culture. Reform movements included temperance, education, and public asylum. Abolition grew as a result of the reform movement, and finally, the women's rights movement grew when women experienced inequality in other reform movements. And again, the Seneca Falls Convention is the main event for you to remember for the women's rights movement in the antebellum. So that antebellum means before the war. And so once we get closer to the Civil War, the women's rights movement will be put on hold, and then it will resume again. All right, so we will pick this up with the next lecture. I hope to see you back. Thank you for watching number 31.